Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. Today we are going to build a TweetChat clone using React, TailwindCSS and Socket.io. We will implement some of the key features of a TweetChat, such as colorful names, badges, live chat scrolling, and also an emoji picker. We will leverage on the Socket.io library to establish a real-time WebSocket connection with a custom server that I personally set up for this build. We will be able to send our own custom messages and broadcast them to all the users connected, and also be able to receive a continuous stream of messages coming from a bot, in order to simulate a live chat. Obviously the chat will be open, so everyone who joins will be able to send their own custom messages. So be sure to check out the online demo to try the chat. I'll leave you the link down in the description. Before we get started, please be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And also, if you have any kind of question or just want to reach me out, feel free to join my Discord server. Now, let's start the build. So open up your code editor and let's create a new React project using Vite. We will choose the React Typescript template provided by Vite, in order to have the TypeScript support enabled in our whole project. After that, we need to install ESLint and some related plugin to enable the linting support for React, TypeScript and React hooks. Inside the file eslintrc.json, we need to put the ESLint configuration. Here, feel free to just copy and paste my configuration. We need also pretter to enable the file indentation when we hit save. Inside the file pretter.rc, we need to put the pretter configuration as well. Here again, you can copy and paste my configuration. Next, we need to install TailwindCSS. Let's also create the Tailwind configuration file, in which we have to specify the template files that Tailwind need to parse. In order to enable Tailwind, we need to open up the index.css file, remove the previous content, and paste the Tailwind directives. We can also remove the app.css file and get rid of the content inside the app.tsx file. The assets folder can be removed as well. Finally, we need two other dependencies: Faker.js to generate some fake data, and React icons, a set of icons made for React. Now that we have the main dependency installed, we can start working on the application itself. Inside the Tailwind config file, let's define a custom font family named Twitch. This font family will be similar to the actual font family used by the Twitch application. By default, it will use the Inter font, and it will fall back to other fonts if Inter will be unavailable. Inside the index.html file, we have to update the title name of the page to TweetChat, and also import the Inter font specifying the Google font link. Back to the index.css file, we need to set a default style to the body of the page. Here we just set a dark background, the white text color, and the font family to Twitch. Now head to the app.tsx file, let's add some initial content. Here we wrap everything inside a main element that will center every children element by simply setting display to grid, place item center, and taking the full height of the page with min h screen. Also, let's add a simple hello world blue heading, just to check that everything is working fine. As you can see, the content is correctly centered within the page. If you go back to the final application, we can identify the components involved in our TweetChat. So here we have the chat message area, or the area where our messages will be displayed. Then we have the chat message as a single entity. And finally, the send message form area. Let's start by defining a component named chat inside the components folder. This component will represent our whole chat. It consists in a div element that will take full width until it reaches a max of 550 pixels, some padding on the X and Y axis, rounded borders, a dark color compared to the background, and a little bit of opacity. As we have seen before, it will contain two inner components, the chat messages box area and the send message form area. So let's define these other two inner components. We can first define the chat messages box as an inline component of the current file. The peculiarity of this component is that it must be scrollable, because it will contain multiple chat messages that we want to possibly scroll through. To achieve this, we define a div element with a fixed height set to 700% of the current viewport height, and overflow set to auto, in order to be scrollable. Now let's define a separate file for the send message form component, since it will be a much larger component. For now, this form will only contain two inner elements. An input text element where we can type our message. It will take full width, rounded borders, a dark gray background, and when it will be focused, it will have pink borders. Then we have the submit button to submit the form and send the message to the server. The button will contain the text chat with a pink background, some padding, floated on the right side, and with rounded borders. Now back to the chat component, let's import this form. Then back to our app component, let's render the chat that we have just created. Cool, now let's take a look at the result. Before we start implementing the chat message, we need to define some entity models. So let's create a file named models.ts inside the utils folder, where we are going to define some custom interfaces. Let's start with the message model interface. A message model is composed of a string ID, an author, and the content of the message. Then we have to define also the model of an author. An author will have the RGB color of his username, the username, and some badges. The badges in this case will be a subset of Twitch badges, like the moderator badge, the VIP badge, Prime, and Turbo badges. Let's define also some helpers function to generate fake messages using Faker.js. First create a file named helpers.ts. Then define a function called generateFakeMessage. Basically, this function will generate a fake message leveraging on the library Faker.js. For generating the message ID, we can use datatype.uid method. For generating a random color, we can use internet.color method, passing it an RGB value. The same is for the username, where we can use internet.username method provided by Faker. For the badges, we are going to define a custom generator method. Finally, for the message content, we generate a simple sentence using the Faker lorem property. Cool! Next, we need to define the function to generate random badges. This function will leverage an utility function provided by Faker based on the likelihood of executing a particular function. What we are trying to achieve here is to assign to each badge a probability to being effectively generated. For example, we assign a 10% probability to have a VIP badge within the badge list that we are creating. The same is for the moderator and turbo badges. Instead, we assign a much higher probability to the prime badge, up to 20% likelihood of being generated. Actually, the methods that we have just built here will also be used by the server in order to continuously generate fake messages to push inside the chat. Okay, now we can finally start implementing the chat message. Inside the components folder, let's create the chatmessage.tsx file. Before starting writing the actual code, let's take a look on how the chat message is designed. You can see that we have in this order the eventual badge of the user, the colored username, and the actual content of the message. Now, back to the chat message component, let's start by defining the input props. Here we will take in input the message to render and also all the props of a div element. Let's also destructure these props. Next, let's define some useful variables. First, we define the badges variable that will render all the author-owned badges. What we need to do here is to map every author badges to an image representing that badge. We will reference some images that I put inside the public folder. We also assign a small size to this image and place it self-centered inside the inline_flex div in which it will be wrapped. Actually, we also have to import these images related to these badges inside the referenced folder. I already done this, so you can just copy and paste these images into your own folder. Next, we define another variable called author. This variable will be used to render the author name with the color associated to the user. To add the color, we have to specify the property color within the style attribute. Finally, we can define the markup of the component. First, we define a div parent container where we will set the text font size to 50 pixels, some side padding, rounded borders, a light gray background when we hover the message, a custom line 8, and finally the class name prop passed by the parent component. Inside this div, we will have another div to include the author badges and the username, displayed using an inline_flex and aligned by the baseline, and a span to render the content of the message. In this case, we need to add some left margin for spacing out from the author username. And also, we need to set the overflow wrap to break words in order to prevent the message content overflowing horizontally. Cool! Now that we have completed the chat message, let's try to display some fake messages inside the chat. To do this, let's define a custom hook called useChatMessages inside the hooks folder. Let's start by defining a new staked hook to store our messages. Next, let's define a welcome message to display as a first message of the chat. And also some follow-up messages using the previous function generate fake messages. We need also to return the messages stored inside the useState hook in order to be readable from the outside. Back to the chat component, let's import the useChatMessages hook. The chat messages box component will be in charge of rendering each chat message, so we need to pass the messages variable as a prop of that component. Next, we need first accept in input that messages variable, and then define a variable called messageList that will map each message to a chat message component. Finally, we simply render the message list. Okay, now let's take a look at the result. Cool, we have the chat messages displayed as expected. As you can see, first we have the welcome message, followed by the other 5 fake messages. You can also see that when I move the mouse over each message, we got a nice hover effect. Great, now we are ready to display the messages coming from our server. Okay guys, now I want to quickly show you how I set up the server for this build. For the sake of the video, I won't explain how to create this server, but if you're really interested, I will make a separate video about it. So let me know in the comment. So here we have a simple Node.js Express application, which is accepting incoming WebSocket connection using the Socket.io library. When a new connection is detected, the server assigns to that connection a custom username. In that way, when a user sends multiple messages in the chat, it will still have the same username. Also, when a new message is received, the server will first filter possible bad words and then broadcast that message to all the connected users. I also set up a bot that every 10 seconds sends a fake message inside the chat. Now that we know how the server works, we can establish a WebSocket connection from our React application to this server in order to read and send the messages towards the chat. Back in our client application, we need to install the Socket.io client library in order to be able to connect to the server. Next, we need to add an environment variable file to store the endpoint of the server. Currently, I have the server listening on port 4000. If you are using Vite, you have to prefix your environment variables with the Vite_string. Now we need to establish a connection to the server. To do this, let's create a new hook called useChatConnection. First, we define a variable that will store the endpoint of the server. Then, we define a function to connect to the server using the I/O function provided by the Socket.io client. We also set to 5 the maximum reconnection attempts. Inside the hook, we have to define a state to store the WebSocket connection. Within a use effect, we will try to establish and save the connection to our server. Here is vital to define a return function which will close the socket connection on unmounting, thus to prevent memory leak. Finally, we return the socket connection. If we go back to the use chat messages, we can start using the hook that we have just created. Then we need to define a function to append a new message when we receive or send a new message into the chat. In order to prevent the array of messages handled by the useState growing endlessly and fill up all the memory, on each new message we receive, we are going to merge the last 30 messages of the chat with the new message received. In this way, we will get at most 31 messages displayed inside the chat. So let's define the message window to 30. And also we can get rid of the previous fake messages, because now we are going to display the messages received by the bot or from other users. To achieve this last feature, we need to listen the event new message emitted by the server when a new message is pushed into the chat. So let's attach a listener inside a use effect using the on method provided by Socket.io. When we receive a new message from the server, we are going to execute the previous function append new message. Here too, we must unsubscribe from this event when we are unmounting. To do this, we can use the off method provided by Socket.io. Now let's take a look at the results. As you can see, we are receiving the messages from the server bot, so the WebSocket connection is correctly working. There is a problem though. When we receive a new message from the server, the chat does not automatically scroll to the last received message. The official Twitch chat has the live chat scrolling enabled by default, but if we happen to slightly scroll the chat, the automatic chat scrolling will be turned off. So back to the code, let's implement this cool feature. Let's create a new hook called useChat live mode scrolling. Here we need to define a state that tracks whether the chat live scrolling is enabled or not. In this case, we are going to use a useRef hook with a generic type that we get from input, in order to detect if the chat is being scrolled up. Next, we need to define a callback function which will scroll the chat to the latest received message. Here basically, we need to scroll into the view of the last element child within the chat message container. This function will be executed every time we receive a new message, but only if the live mode scrolling is currently enabled. To achieve this, we need to define a news effect that will run every time we have a new message. In this way, if we are scrolling up the chat to see older messages, we won't be scrolled down due to the arrival of new messages. Now let's return some of the values provided by this hook in order to be used. Let's attach this hook inside the chat component. Since we are going to attach the reference to the chat messages box component, we need to specify the hook generic type as a div element. and also pass the chat messages as input. Actually, we can still attach the reference to the chat messages box component because React element components do not expose their reference by default. To achieve this, we have to apply the React forward reference pattern. Now that we have correctly passed the reference, we can actually take a look whether the chat messages area is being automatically scrolled downward when we receive new messages. As you can see, the chat is automatically scrolled down to the latest received message. However, if we scroll upwards to see older messages, we are still being scrolled down due to new message arrival. So let's fix this behavior. So let's go back to the use chat live mode scrolling hook. We are going to define a function to toggle the live mode scrolling on and off. Here, what we need to do is to check if the chat area is being scrolled up. To make this check, we have to do some dumb calculation. First, we have to take the current scroll height, scroll to top, and the client date of the chat messages box area. Then we calculate the current scroll of that area, which will be given by the sum of the client height plus the scroll to top, rounded to the smallest integer. Now, to check if the area is being scrolled up, we just need to see if the current scroll is different from the scroll height. So, if these two values are not equal, it means that the chat message area has been scrolled up, so the live mode must be turned off. The function that we have just implemented needs to be executed whenever we scroll the chat message area. So inside the news effect, let's attach this function as an event handler of the scroll events. Let's see the outcome. Now, if the chat message area is not scrolled, the chat live mode scrolling will be turned on, and as soon as I scroll upwards, it will be turned off. Great! To visually hint whether the chat live mode scrolling is enabled or not, we can create a new alert component similar to the one used by Twitch. Let's create a new component called chat paused alert. It will take in input an onClick callback function to be executed when we click on the alert. It will render two different string labels based on whether the alert is overread or not. If it's overread, we will display a down arrow icon along with the text "See new messages." Otherwise, we will display a pause button icon along with chat paused due to scroll. Finally, the markup will consist in a div with a fixed width, center align, some padding, rounded borders, a dark background, cursor set to pointer, and the class name prop set by the parent. It will also have the listeners to handle the component overstate and the onClick event listener. Now let's attach this component inside the chat. Obviously, we want to display the alert only if the chat is being scrolled. In order to give to the alert a floating effect, we have to apply the alert with an absolute position relative to the parent div container. Also, when we click on the alert, we will execute the scroll new message function in order to simulate the see new messages effect. Great, let's see the result. Now, whenever we scroll the chat upwards, the alert pops out to indicate that the chat live mode scrolling is being disabled. If we got over the alert, we see that the label changed to See New Messages, and if we click on it, we got pushed down to the latest received message. Now, let's implement the possibility to send messages into the chat. First, let's step inside the send message form. Here, we need to accept the input, a callback function, to execute when we send the message, and also the class name prop. Then we need a state to store the message typed. We need also to attach the onChange event listener to the input text. Finally, we have to define a function to handle the form submit. Here we have to first prevent the default behavior of the form element, trim the message and also cut it to a max number of characters. In this case, we set the cap to 300 characters. Then, if the message is not empty, we can execute the callback function, passing it the filtered message. And finally, clear the input text area. Now, let's implement the onSend callback function inside the useChatMessages hook. Here, we simply send the message type by emitting the event message that will be captured and handled by our custom server. Cool. Now let's pass this function down to the send message component. To do this, let's go back to the chat component, extract the send function from the hook, and pass it to the send message form component. Also, let's add some top margin to better spacing the form from the chat messages area. Now we are able to send our own messages inside the chat. Also, if you open separate tabs, you can see that the messages are effectively broadcasted by the server as expected. The last feature that we miss is the possibility to include emoji in our messages. To implement that, we are going to install an external package called Emoji Picker React and also use hook-ts. In order to use the Emoji Picker React library, we need to set the global variable to window. So let's step inside the vite config to add it. Now let's create a new component called Emoji Picker Button. It will consist of a simple button, then, when it's clicked, it will show up a custom Emoji Picker box. The component will take in input a callback function that will be executed when the user speaks a specific emoji. For now, let's assume that the picker is always visible. We will add the interactivity parts of this component later on. The markup will consist of a relative div with two inner elements. First, we have a button to open the emoji picker. The button will be represented by a simple smiley emoji face to hint that we are going to deal with emoji selection. Next, we have an absolutely positioned div that will contain the picker component. Here, to display the picker just above the button component, we have to set bottom 8 and right 0. Okay, now let's attach this component inside the send message form. Here we want the emoji picker button being displayed on the right side of the input text area. To achieve this, we need to add a relative div container that will surround both the input text area and the emoji picker button. To position the button on the right side, we have to set the position to absolute, top 0, bottom 0, and right position to 2. Also, we want an inline flex with item center to vertically center the button itself. When we will pick a specific emoji, we are going to append the selected emoji to the current message string. Great, let's see what we have just built. As you can see, the emoji picker is being displayed correctly. Currently the picker does not have any kind of interactivity, so it will be always displayed, and actually we are not able to add an emoji into our message yet. So let's go implement the interactivity part. Let's start by creating a new hook called useEmojiPicker. It will take in input a function to handle the pick of a specific emoji. First, we need a state to store the current visibility of the picker. Then, we need to take the reference of the picker component using an useref hook. Now let's define a function to handle the click on an emoji. Here we're simply going to execute the function passed in input. We define also a function to toggle the visibility of the picker. And finally, we use a custom hook called useOnClickOutside, provided by the useHook-ts library. This hook will execute a function when we click outside the specified element. In this case, if we click outside the picker box, we want the picker to close and be no longer visible. Cool, now let's export this function. Next step is to attach this hook inside the Emoji Picker button. So let's extract all the functions that we have just defined and then attach them to their related use cases. Great, let's see the results. As you can see, now we are able to toggle the visibility of the picker, and also able to select different emoji to include in our messages. The last thing that I want to do is to add a custom style both to the right scrollbar and to the emoji picker, in order to make them more stylish. To do this, let's step inside the file index.css. Let's start by customizing the right scrollbar. Here we set a width of 8 pixels, the track being transparent, and the thumb to be gray with rounded borders. Regarding the emoji picker, we will declare its custom style inside the layer components. Here basically we are going to remove the outline shadow of the picker box and also set the text color of the picker input search area to black. Cool! Now the scrollbar feels very good. The picker style has improved as well. Now in the search area we can search for specific emoji. Nice! Alright guys, our chat is now ready to be used. As always, if you wanna try it, there is a link down in the description. If you want to give me a feedback or have any suggestion for next video, please leave me a comment and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We will see you in the next one.